Hi guys, welcome to our channel. And today I am going to walk you through, in sometimes excruciating detail, a theory published recently arguing that the pyramid complexes contain a hydraulic lifting machine that could move massive building stones. A central mystery to ancient construction has been how these blocks were lifted from one course to the next. Traditional archaeology says gangs of men used wooden rollers and water to haul them up dirt ramps. On the other end of the spectrum, people believe in sonic devices or aliens. I am not a scholar, but I grew up in the 90s on a large farm working with my hands and mechanical force. I believe we do not give ancient Egyptian engineers enough credit for thinking smarter. Today we are going to look at the evidence for a specific engineering solution that uses water as a source of power. To really understand the sheer scale of the mystery we are talking about today, you have to stop looking at the pyramids as postcards and start looking at them as construction sites. I have spent a large portion of my life on a farm in the Midwest, and if there is one thing that environment teaches you, it is a profound respect for the weight of things. When you are trying to move a rusted-out tractor engine or a pallet of wet limestone blocks without the right equipment, you quickly realize that the earth does not want things to move. Gravity is a constant adversary. Now, imagine that problem multiplied by 2.3 million. That is the estimated number of stone blocks in the Great Pyramid alone. Most of those stones weigh about 2.5 tons, but some of the massive granite beams used in the higher chambers weigh closer to 80 tons. That is the equivalent of moving a dozen fully grown African elephants in a single piece and lifting them hundreds of feet into the air with enough precision to fit a razor blade between the joints. For over a century, the standard explanation offered by mainstream archaeology has been the ramp theory. We have all seen the illustrations in history books. Thousands of men, shirtless and straining, pulling these massive sleds up giant dirt ramps that wrap around a pyramid like a coiled snake. But if you have ever actually worked with dirt and heavy loads, you know that ramps have a dirty little secret. To maintain a slope that a human being can actually pull a load up, the ramp has to be incredibly long. For a ramp to reach the top of the Great Pyramid, it would have to be over a mile long and would actually require more material to build than the pyramid itself. It just does not make sense from a logistical or engineering standpoint. You do not build a second mountain just to build the first one. Then you have the other side of the aisle. These are the folks who see the impossibility of the task and decide that the only answer is something supernatural or extraterrestrial. They talk about acoustic levitation, where the Egyptians supposedly used giant tuning forks to make the rocks float, or they claim that a lost civilization with nuclear power or anti-gravity technology did all the heavy lifting. I grew up reading Graham Hancock and listening to late-night radio shows about these theories, so I understand the appeal. It is fun to think about. But as someone who has spent years designing and building mechanical systems, I think these theories often do a massive disservice to the actual intelligence of the ancient Egyptians. We do not need to invent aliens to explain how they did it. We just need to stop assuming that they were less clever than we are today. In my view, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. I believe the ancient Egyptians were master engineers who understood the laws of physics and behavior of water better than almost any civilization that followed them. They did not just use brute force, and they did not use magic. They used a specific engineering solution that was staring them in the face every single year when the Nile River flooded. They used the power of hydraulics. This is not just a wild guess. A groundbreaking research paper published in 2024 has provided compelling evidence that the oldest pyramid in Egypt, the Djoser Step Pyramid at Saqqara, was actually built using a sophisticated hydraulic lifting machine. Before we look at the machine itself, we have to look at the landscape. Egypt was a much wetter place 4,500 years ago. What we now see as a dry and dusty desert was once a landscape shaped by seasonal rains and flash floods. The Egyptians did not just fear these floods. They managed them. They built canals, they built basins, and they understood how to direct the flow of water to irrigate their crops and turn their country into a food surplus empire. This ability to control the flow of water is the foundational skill of their entire civilization. If you can move water through a desert to grow grain, you can move water into a construction site to move stone. Let us look at the Dosa complex at Saqqara. This site is home to what is often called the Great Enclosure, or the Gisrel Mudeh. For decades, archaeologists have argued about what this massive rectangular stone structure was. Some said it was a fort to protect the king. Others said it was a giant corral for ritual animal sacrifices. But if you look at it through the eyes of an engineer, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like a check dam. The Gisrel Mudeh sits right in the path of a natural wadi, which is a dry riverbed that fills up rapidly during a rainstorm. The walls of this enclosure are not the same height all the way around. The western wall is higher than the eastern wall. This is a classic design for a sediment trap and a water management system. When a flash flood would come roaring down the wadi, it would hit these walls. The water would slow down, the sand and silt would settle to the bottom, and the clean water would then be directed through a series of channels toward the pyramid complex. This is not just religious architecture. This is an industrial water treatment plant, and it leads directly to one of the most mysterious features of the Saqqara site, which is the deep trench. This trench is a massive excavation that is nearly 400 meters long and 27 meters deep. It surrounds a pyramid complex. For years, the textbook said this was a dry moat meant for defense. But think about that for a second. Why would you dig a trench that deep into solid limestone just for defense when you could just build a taller wall? If you fill that trench with water, everything changes. Suddenly, the trench is not a moat. It is a reservoir. It is a holding tank for the power source of the construction site. The research teams in 2024 found evidence that this trench was divided into different compartments that acted as a water purification system. As the water moved from one compartment to the next, it would get cleaner and the pressure would be regulated. This is essentially a giant stone plumbing system that sits right under the feet of the pyramid builders. Mainstream Egyptologists often fall into the trap of using religion as a catch-all for things they cannot explain. If they find a strange stone pipe or an oddly specific cut in a rock that does not seem to have a purpose, they say it was done to please the gods or to symbolize the journey to the afterlife. I find this incredibly frustrating. We do not do that with Leonardo da Vinci. We recognize that he was a man of his time who lived in a very religious society. But when we look at his designs for helicopters and tanks, we call him an engineer. We should give the Egyptians the same respect. A rational Egyptian engineer would not spend 20 years and thousands of man-hours digging a massive trench into solid rock just for a symbol. They would do it because it served a vital practical purpose. The purpose of all this water management was to feed a system that could do the work that human muscles could not. The construction of a pyramid is essentially an exercise in lifting. Every single stone has to go up. In a world before steel cranes and internal combustion engines, water was the most powerful lifting force available. By using the natural elevation of the land and the predictable pressure of captured water, the Egyptians created a way to lift massive weights using a flotation system. When you stand at the bottom of the Dosa pyramid and look at the shaft that lead deep into the earth, it is easy to feel overwhelmed by the mystery. There are miles of tunnels and rooms that look like a labyrinth. Many people assumed these were just built to confuse grave robbers, but many of these tunnels lead to vertical shafts that align perfectly with the industrial layout of the trench. These are not just burial chambers. They are the cylinders of a massive hydraulic engine. We are going to look at how these shafts worked as a piston, and how a single granite plug could control the movement of a stone that weighs as much as a truck. The impossible task of building Giza was not solved by more slaves or bigger whips. It was solved by thinking smarter. It was solved by engineers who looked at the Nile and saw a battery that could be tapped. They saw a way to make the earth itself do the work. As we move forward and look at the technical details of the Dosa lifting machine, I want you to keep that industrial mindset in mind. We are walking through an abandoned factory that was built 4,000 years ago. The priests might have come in later to burn incense and say prayers once the work was done, but the men who designed this site were thinking about pressure, volume, and mechanical advantage. The echoes of Giza are not just whispers of ghosts or the secrets of ancient gods. They are the sounds of flowing water and the grinding of stone on stone. They are the evidence of a civilization that reached a level of technical sophistication that we are only just beginning to rediscover. Now that we have set the stage and looked at the landscape as a tool, we need to dive deep into the plumbing of the pyramid itself to see how this machine actually functioned. We have to go down into the shafts and look at the granite boxes that acted as a valve for a system that changed the world. This was not a tomb that happened to have some pipes. This was a machine that was built to last for eternity. Now, I want to pivot from the subterranean hydraulic systems we just discussed and look at another specific engineering solution that has been dismissed by mainstream archaeology for centuries. This is what I call the Herodotus Enigma. About 450 years before the birth of Christ, a Greek traveler and historian named Herodotus visited Egypt. He is often called the father of history, but because some of his stories seem a bit tall, he is also frequently called the father of lies. However, when it comes to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, Herodotus provides us with a very specific, very mechanical description of how the stones were raised. And I think we need to look at his words not as the ramblings of a tourist, but as the observations of someone who may have been looking at the remnants or the tradition of a very real industrial process. Herodotus claimed that after the first stage of the pyramid was finished in the shape of steps, the remaining stones were raised by means of machines made of short pieces of wood. He describes these machines being used on every tier of the pyramid. The idea was that a stone would be lifted from the ground to the first step by one machine, and once it arrived there, it was placed on a second machine which lifted it to the next level. This continued all the way to the top. Now, mainstream Egyptologists almost universally reject this. They say Herodotus was writing 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, and that he was just repeating local folklore. They prefer the ramp theory. But I want to walk you through why the ramp theory, from a practical engineering standpoint, is an absolute nightmare, and why the short wooden machines make much more sense if you have ever actually worked with heavy loads. If you are going to build a ramp to the top of the Great Pyramid, which is 480 feet tall, that ramp has to be incredibly long to maintain a grade that humans can actually hold stones up. We are talking about a ramp that would require as much material as a pyramid itself. You would have to build a second pyramid just to build the first one. That is not thinking smarter. That is thinking harder in the most inefficient way possible. As someone who has spent a lot of time on a farm moving heavy equipment and timber, I can tell you that we always look for a way to use leverage rather than brute force. If I have a heavy log, I am not going to build a half-mile-long dirt ramp to get it onto a truck. I am going to use a lever. The description Herodotus gives us sounds exactly like a series of cranes oscillating levers. Imagine a wooden frame that uses the weight of the stone against a counterweight. If the Egyptians understood the basin irrigation and the hydraulic forces we talk about in the first segment, they certainly understood the principle of the lever. This is where I think we fail to give them credit. We assume that because they did not have electricity or internal combustion engines, they must have been limited to dragging things like oxen. But a lever is a simple machine that multiplies force. If you have a machine made of short pieces of wood, as Herodotus describes, you are looking at a modular, portable lifting system. Now, here is where the enigma gets really interesting and where the mainstream scholars really start to lose their cool. Herodotus also mentioned that the Egyptians used iron tools to build the pyramids. For a long time, this was used as a primary evidence to call him a liar. Mainstream history tells us the Old Kingdom of Egypt was a Bronze Age society and that iron was not used until much later. They say the pyramids were carved with copper chisels and stone hammers. I have worked with copper and I have worked with granite. If you try to carve a massive block of hard granite with a soft copper chisel, you are going to spend more time sharpening your tool than you are carving the stone. It is just not efficient. But recently, we have started to find evidence that iron might have been more common than we thought. We have found meteoritic iron in early tombs, and some researchers argue that the Egyptians could have been smelting small amounts of iron much earlier than the official record states. Even if they were not using iron for everything, the mention of iron by Herodotus might be a translation of a word that meant something else, perhaps a specific type of hardened alloy or metal they kept secret. But regardless of the metal, the focus should be on the machines. When Herodotus describes these wooden machines, he is describing a process that would allow a smaller group of skilled technicians to do the work of thousands of laborers. I want you to wrap your mind around that. Instead of 100,000 men dying in the sun to pull a stone up a date ramp, you have a few dozen men on each tier of the pyramid operating a wooden lift. It is industrial, it is repeatable, and most importantly, it fits the physical evidence left on the stones themselves. If you look at many of the stones on the Great Pyramid and other sites, you will see strange notches and holes. Mainstream archaeologists call these Lewis holes or mounting points for decorative features. But if you look at them through the lens of a mechanical engineer, they look like attachment points for a lifting rig. They look like places where a wooden machine would grab the stone to hoist it. In the first segment, I mentioned the vertical scrapes on the walls of the north shaft at the Dosa complex. We see similar patterns of wear and tear in various places that suggest a mechanical process was at play. I don't agree with the idea that everything has to be a religious mystery. If a stone has a specific cut in it that allows a wooden beam to lock into place, I'm going to assume it was for a beam, not for a symbolic representation of the sun god. We have to give these ancient engineers the same latitude of rationality that we give to people today. They wanted to go home at the end of the day just like we do. They wanted to finish the project without losing their entire workforce to exhaustion. The machines Herodotus described might have looked like a shadoof. For those of you who don't know, a shadoof is a very ancient irrigation tool that is still used in some parts of the world today. It is a long pole on a pivot with a bucket on one end and a weight on the other. It allows a person to lift large amounts of water with very little effort. If you take that same principle and you scale it up, you have a pyramid building machine. You have a lever that can move a 2-ton block of limestone. I have often thought about the logistics of the pyramid sites. You have thousands of stones arriving by boat. You have to get them from the harbor to the site, and then you have to get them up the structure. If you are using a series of shadoof-like machines, you could create a vertical assembly line. One machine lifts the stone to level 1. The next machine takes it to level 2, and so on. This would be incredibly fast compared to building and then demolishing a massive ramp. I know that some people will say that wood was scarce in Egypt and that they could not have built thousands of these machines. But we know they were importing cedar from Lebanon by the boatload. They had the materials. They had the knowledge of ropes and pulleys. We see ropes in the archaeological record that are thick enough to tow a ship. So why is it so hard to believe they could build a wooden crane? The reason I am so focused on this is that it changes the entire narrative of human history. If the pyramids were built with machines, it means the ancient Egyptians were not just a religious society obsessed with the dead, but an industrial society that had master mechanical advantage. It means they were engineers in the truest sense of the word. They were designers who looked at a problem, like how to lift a 20-ton granite beam 40 feet in the air, and they came up with a mechanical solution rather than just throwing more bodies at the problem. I want to take a moment to address the skeptics who say that Herodotus was just making things up to impress his Greek audience. While it is true that he included some mythological stories in his writing, he was often very careful to distinguish between what he saw with his own eyes and what he was told by the priests. When he describes the machines, he is giving us a technical description. He even mentions the cost of the radishes and onions fed to the workers. That kind of mundane detail usually points to a real source of information. Everything about the Herodotus account screams an industrial process that has been lost to time. It is like looking at a modern factory through the eyes of someone who does not understand electricity. They might describe the robots as being moved by invisible spirits, but they would still describe the physical arms and the movement. Herodotus was describing the physical arms of the Egyptian construction industry. So, if we combine the hydraulic lifting theory from the first segment with the wooden machine theory from Herodotus, we start to see a very different picture of ancient Egypt. We see a culture that could manage water to lift stones internally through shafts and use wooden machines to move stones externally along the tiers. It is a multimodal transportation and lifting system. This is what you see in a modern construction site. You don't just use one tool. You use a crane for some things, a forklift for others, and maybe a hoist for the rest. I believe that the more we look at these sites with an eye for engineering, the more the religious and ceremonial explanations start to feel like a thin veil. We are standing in the middle of a massive, ancient construction site that has been cleaned up and turned into a museum. But if you look closely at the floor, you see the oil stains. You see the scrape marks. You see the holes where the heavy machinery was bolted down. In the coming segments, I am going to walk you through some even more specific evidence of these machines. We are going to look at the traces left in the stone that mainstream archaeology ignores because it doesn't fit the ramp narrative. I am going to show you why the physics of a wooden lever are more than enough to build the Great Pyramid. We don't need aliens, and we don't need 100,000 slaves. We just need some very smart Egyptians with short pieces of wood and a deep understanding of mechanical force. It is easy to look at a pyramid and think it is a mountain of stone that was moved by magical misery. But when you have spent your life working with your hands, you see it differently. You see a puzzle. You see a series of problems that were solved by people who were just as smart as we are today. They didn't have computers, but they had the Nile, they had leverage, and they had the time to get it right. I am not saying that Herodotus was right about everything, but I am saying that we should stop calling him a liar just because he mentioned machines. We should start looking for those machines. We should look for the wear patterns on the steps. We should look for the remnants of the wooden frames in the unexcavated areas. Because if he was right about the machines, then the history of how we built our world is much more interesting than a simple story about dirt ramps and whips. This brings us to a critical point in our investigation. If these machines existed, What happened to them? Why don't we find them in the tombs? Well, that is like asking why you don't find a 20th century bulldozer buried in the basement of a skyscraper. You use the tools to build the building, and then you take the tools to the next job. Oh, if they were made of wood, you burn them for fuel or they rot away in the damp soil of the floodplain. The absence of the tool does not mean the tool never existed. The building itself is the evidence of the tool. The Great Pyramid is a testament to a level of precision that we can barely match today. You do not get that precision with a ramp and a gang of exhausted men. You get it with a machine. You get it with a system that can move a block and place it with the accuracy of a hair's breadth. The Herodotus enigma is not a mystery of history. It is a challenge to our modern ego. It is a reminder that we are not the first people to understand the power of the machine. As we move forward, keep that image of the wooden lever in your mind. Think about the sound of creaking timber and the sight of a 2-ton block rising slowly into the air as a counterweight drops. This was the reality of the Giza Plateau. It was a place of noise, of industry, and of incredible mechanical ingenuity. It was a machine that built the pyramids. Now that we have walked through the mechanical heart of the door complex and looked at the plumbing beneath the sand, we have to address the sheer scale of the operation that will be required to feed such a machine. If you have ever worked on a large construction site or a busy farm, you know that the actual work of building is often secondary to the nightmare of logistics. You can have the best crane in the world, but if the trucks cannot get the materials to the site, that crane is just a very expensive lawn ornament. In the case of the ancient Egyptian pyramids, we are talking about moving millions of tons of limestone and granite across a landscape that is today a blistering desert. To understand how the hydraulic system functioned, we have to look at the landscape not as a static graveyard, but as a living, breathing industrial network. This is what I call the logistics of the living machine. The machine was not just a pyramid itself or the shafts beneath it. The machine was the entire Nile Valley, harnessed and directed with a level of precision that we are only just beginning to appreciate. The mainstream perspective has always leaned heavily on the idea of thousands of men dragging these stones on sleds across the sand. They point to the famous wall painting in the tomb of Jehutilotep, showing a massive statue being moved by gangs of men while a worker pours water on the sand in front of a sled to reduce friction. I have seen this image 1,000 times, and while it proves they move things on sleds, it does not prove that this was the most efficient or primary method for a project as massive as a pyramid. If you have ever tried to drag a heavy piece of equipment through mud or loose soil, you know that friction is your worst enemy. Even with lubricants like milk or water, the energy expenditure is astronomical. If the Egyptians were as smart as I believe they were, they would have looked for a way to let physics do the heavy lifting. This brings us back to the Nile. During the 3rd millennium before Christ, the Nile was not quite the same river we see today. The climate was wetter, and the river had multiple branches that have since dried up or shifted. One of these, the Khufu branch, supposedly ran right past the Giza Plateau. For the door complex at Saqqara, we have to look at the evidence of ancient canals that connected the floodplains directly to construction sites. If you want to move a block that weighs 6 tons, you do not put it on a sled if you can put it on a boat. Buoyancy is the ultimate cheat code of the physical world. A stone that requires 50 men to drag across land can be moved by a couple of men with poles if it is floating on a properly designed raft. But the challenge is not just moving it along the river. The challenge is getting it from the river, up the elevation of the plateau, and directly into the heart of the construction site. This is where the concept of the living machine becomes truly fascinating. We have already discussed the Giza El Mudeh, that massive rectangular enclosure that acted as a check dam. If we view this entire region as an industrial park, The Giza El Mudir is the intake valve. It captured the flash flood from the western wadis and held that water in a series of basins. This was not just for drinking or farming. This was the fuel for the hydraulic transport system. By controlling the release of this water into a series of canals and trenches, the Egyptian engineers could essentially create a staircase of water. Imagine a series of locks, much like the ones we use in the Panama Canal today, but constructed from stone and earth. By moving stones onto rafts in a low-level basin and then filling that basin with water from a higher reservoir, you can lift the stones to the next level without a single man having to strain his back against a rope. The stones themselves tell a story of incredible logistics. The majority of the core of the pyramids was quarried locally, but the high-quality white limestone for the casing came from Chura, on the opposite side of the Nile. The massive granite beams, some weighing over 50 tons, came from Aswan, which is over 800 kilometers to the south. Moving these items from the quarry to the river is one thing, but getting them to the exact height needed on a pyramid that is hundreds of feet tall is another. If we accept the hydraulic lift theory, the logistics chain becomes much more elegant. The stones arrive by boat at a harbor near the site. They are moved into a canal system that leads directly to the base of the pyramid complex. From there, they enter the trench system we talked about earlier. I want you to think about the deep trench at the south end of the Door Pyramid. If this trench was connected to a canal, it essentially becomes a loading dock. The water level in the trench could be regulated by the check dams and the granite plugs in the shafts. When a stone arrived on a raft, it could be positioned directly over the flotation piston in the north shaft. Now, I know what you are thinking because I have thought it too. How do you get a 6-ton block from a raft and a trench into a vertical shaft? This is where the side tunnels and the auxiliary chambers come into play. Many of these features are currently labeled as storage rooms or symbolic galleries make much more sense if you view them as access points for maneuvering heavy loads. If the water level is high, the raft is level with a side tunnel. You slide the stone off the raft onto rollers, move it a short distance into the shaft, and place it on the lifting platform. Then, you pull the plug, the water level rises, and the stone is carried up. This system would have required a massive amount of coordination. You would need a team at the check dams managing the reservoirs, a team at the granite plugs in the north and south shafts, and a team of divers or workers in the tunnels to manage the loading process. It is a highly technical, synchronized operation. To me, this feels much more like the ancient Egyptians I have studied. They were a people who obsessed over the flow of the Nile. Their entire calendar, their religion, and their economy were built on the management of water. Why would they suddenly abandon all that technical knowledge when it came time to build their most important monuments? Why would they revert to the most primitive method of dragging stones up dirt ramps when they had already mastered the art of hydraulic engineering through basin irrigation? There is also the matter of the ramps themselves. To build a ramp that could reach the top of the Great Pyramid at a grade that humans could actually climb while pulling a heavy load, that ramp would have to be over a mile long. It would contain almost as much material as a pyramid itself. Where did all that material go? While archaeologists have found evidence of small ramps at various sites, we have never found the remains of the massive, monolithic structures that would be required for the mainstream theory to work at scale. However, we do find evidence of water management everywhere. We find trenches, we find check dams, we find harbor installations, and we find these mysterious shafts that go deep into the bedrock. When you start looking for the machine, you realize the evidence has been hiding in plain sight because we were looking for wooden tools instead of water logic. The logistics of the living machine also explain the placement of the pyramids. As I mentioned before, They are all located on the west bank, on higher ground, but always within reach of the Nile floodplains. This was not just for the sunset symbolism. It was a practical requirement. You need a reliable source of water to run a hydraulic lift. You also need a way to get rid of that water when you are done. The deep shafts and the porous nature of some of the limestone would have allowed for the system to be drained or for the water to be recycled into lower basin for the next lift. It is a closed-loop system that mimics the natural cycle of the Nile itself. When I look at the door complex, I do not see a tomb that happened to have some weird pits around it. I see an industrial site that was repurposed as a tomb. In our modern world, we do this all the time. We take old warehouses and turn them into lofts. We take old quarries and turn them into parks. To the ancient Egyptians, the effort required to build these sites was so great that they would never have let the infrastructure go to waste. Once a pyramid was finished and the lifting machine was no longer needed, the shaft was sealed, the tunnels were decorated, and the king was laid to rest in a monument that was, quite literally, built by the power of the river he ruled. But there's a final piece to this puzzle that we have to address, and it is the most controversial part of the theory. If this machine worked for the Door Pyramid, which was a step pyramid made of relatively small stones, could it have been scaled up for the truly massive projects like the Great Pyramid of Giza? The logistics for Giza are an order of magnitude more complex. You are moving blocks that are not just 2 tons, but 70 tons. You are lifting them to heights of over 400 feet. Does the hydraulic theory hold up when the scale reaches its absolute limit? In the next part of this series, we are going to travel north to the Giza Plateau and see if the footprints of the living machine can be found beneath the most famous monuments on Earth. We are going to look at the causeways, the mysterious pits, and the massive wall of the Crow to see if the same hydraulic logic that built the first pyramid was used to create the last of the wonders of the ancient world. It is a journey that will take us from the simple mechanics of a farm hand to the highest levels of ancient engineering. And it all starts with the water. Now we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the ramp. For over a century, if you asked any mainstream archaeologist how the stones got to the top, they would point to a ramp. It is a default answer for everything. But the more you look at the physics and the sheer volume of material required, the more the simple dirt ramp starts to look like a logistical nightmare that might have been harder to build than the pyramid itself. I want to walk you through the math and the physical reality of moving a 2.5-ton block of limestone up an incline, because this is where the brute force theory really starts to show its cracks. In my experience working on the farm, if you want to move something heavy up a hill, you do not just get more guys to pull on the rope. Eventually, the rope snaps, or the guys at the front are pulling at an angle that actually pushes the load into the ground rather than up the slope. There is a point of diminishing returns where adding more human muscle actually makes the problem worse. Let us start with the most basic version, which is the straight external ramp. To keep the slope manageable for a team of men pulling a sled, you cannot really go much deeper than a 7 or 8% grade. If you go steeper than that, the men spend all their energy just trying not to slide backward rather than moving the block forward. Now, if you calculate a 7% grade for a structure as tall as a Great Pyramid, which stands at about 481 feet, that ramp has to be over a mile long. Think about that for a second. A mile-long ramp made of mud, brick, and rubble that has to be wide enough for teams of men to pass each other. The volume of material you would need to build that ramp is almost as much as the volume of the pyramid itself. You would essentially be building 2 pyramids just to finish one. And then, once you are done, you have to spend years tearing that mile-long ramp down and hauling the trash away. It just does not scream ancient Egyptian efficiency to me. These people were master planners. They did not do extra work for the sake of it. Then you have the idea of the spiral ramp. This is a theory that they built a ramp that wrapped around the outside of the pyramid like a screw thread as it went up. This solves a length problem, but it introduces a massive engineering headache at the corners. How do you turn a multi-ton stone block on a wooden sled around a sharp corner on a narrow ledge hundreds of feet in the air? You cannot. You would need a massive platform at every corner to reset the pull teams and pivot the block. Plus, if you cover the pyramid in a spiral ramp, you can no longer see the corners of the structure. If you cannot see the corners, you cannot check your alignment or your slope as you build. For a culture that could align the Great Pyramid to true north within 3/60ths of a degree, I find it hard to believe they would use a construction method that blinded their own surveyors. This brings us to a much more interesting idea that has gained traction in the last 15 years, which is the internal ramp theory. This was famously proposed by the French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin. He argued that the Egyptians built the first third of the pyramid using a short external ramp, and then they transitioned to an internal tunnel system that spiraled upward inside the core of the structure. I find this fascinating because it treats the pyramid not just as a pile of stones, but as a functional machine for its own construction. In this model, the internal ramp stays at a shallow grade, and at the corners, there are open spaces where the blocks can be turned. But here's where my engineering brain starts clicking. If you have an internal ramp and you have these vertical shafts like the ones we discussed at the Saqqara complex, why would you rely solely on men pulling ropes? If you have ever used a snatch block or a pulley system to pull a tract out of a ditch, you know that changing the direction of force is a key to everything. I believe the Egyptians were using a counterweight system. Imagine a heavy weight, perhaps a large granite block or even container full of water, sitting in a vertical shaft. If you drop that weight down the shaft, it can pull a block up a ramp on the other side of the pyramid via a system of ropes and rollers. This is basic mechanical advantage. It is what we do every day with elevators and cranes. By using a falling weight to do the heavy lifting, you reduce the number of men needed from thousands to dozens. You are not just using brute force anymore. You are using gravity. I want to talk about the friction of these sleds for a moment because there is a famous wall painting from the tomb of Jehutotep that shows a massive statue being pulled by 172 men. In the front of the sled, there's a man pouring liquid onto the sand. Mainstream archaeology often says this was water used to lubricate the wooden runners. And for a long time, people thought this was just a symbolic gesture or some religious ritual. But a group of physicists in the Netherlands actually tested this in 2014. They found that if you pour just the right amount of water onto sand, it forms what are called capillary bridges, which make the sand much stiffer. This reduces the friction of a sled by about 50%. If you use too much water, it becomes mud and the sled sinks. If you use too little, the sand piles up in front of the runners. But if you hit that sweet spot, the force needed to pull the block is cut in half. This is exactly what I mean when I say we need to give these engineers more credit. They were not just dumping water because it pleased their gods. They were managing the coefficient of friction on a granular level. They were performing field chemistry and physics 4,500 years ago. But even with half the friction, you still have the problem of the ascent. Friction only accounts for the horizontal move. Gravity is the real enemy when you start going up. And this is where the ramp theories usually fall apart for me because they assume the incline was the only solution. If we look back at the hydraulic theories and the idea of water pressure, the ramps start to look less like a path for men to walk on and more like a track for a specialized machine. What if the ramp was not made of dirt and rubble but was a precision-built limestone track? We see evidence of these sorts of tracks at various quarry sites. They have grooves and wear patterns that suggest something was moving over them repeatedly. If you have a lubricated track and a counterweight system hidden inside the pyramid, the ramp becomes a component of a larger mechanical system. I often think about the sheer logistical challenge of feeding and housing 20,000 men to build a pyramid. If you use the brute force ramp method, you need a massive workforce. If you use a mechanical counterweight and hydraulic method, your workforce drops significantly. You need fewer people, but they need to be more skilled. To me, that fits the Egyptian model much better. They were a society of specialists, not just a sea of unnamed laborers being whipped into submission. They were masons, surveyors, and, as I believe the evidence shows, hydraulic engineers. There's a feature in the Great Pyramid called the Grand Gallery that has baffled researchers for centuries. It is a massive, corbelled hole that slants upward at a 26-degree angle. Mainstream theory says it was just a fancy hallway for the pharaoh's funeral. But it has these strange benches along the sides with rectangular slots cut into them at regular intervals. If you look at those slots from a mechanical perspective, they look exactly like the mounting points for a timber framework or braking system. Some researchers have argued that the Grand Gallery was actually a giant ramp for a counterweight. A massive trolley filled with stone weights could have slid down the gallery, pulling the heavy granite slabs of the king's chamber up into place. When you look at the wear marks on the floor of the gallery, they are concentrated in the center, exactly where a trolley would have run. This is the kind of engineering that gets me excited. It is practical, it is elegant, and it solves the problem of how you move a 70-ton granite beam without needing a city worth of people. You use a machine. The pyramid itself is the machine. The ramps, the shafts, and the internal galleries are all parts of a single integrated system designed to overcome the physics of ascent. Every time we find a weird shaft or an oddly placed room, we should be asking ourselves what its mechanical purpose was before we jump to a religious explanation. I know some people will say that we have no written records of these machines. We do not have a blueprint or a manual that says, Step 1, fill the counterweight. But we have to remember that these were state secrets. The technology used to build these monuments was likely the most guarded information in the ancient world. You do not write down how to build your most sacred and expensive structures for everyone to see. You pass it down through guilds of master builders. The evidence is not in the writings. It is in the stones themselves. It is in the scrape marks on the walls of the north shaft at Saqqara. It is in the precision slots of the Grand Gallery. It is in the fact that these buildings exist at all. When you spend your life building things with your hands, you start to develop a sense of how a problem was solved just by looking at the result. When I see a massive limestone block sitting 400 feet in the air, I do not see a miracle, and I do not see 10,000 men screaming as they pull a rope. I see a team of engineers who understood leverage, friction, and the power of a falling weight. I see a society that had mastered the physics of their environment to such a degree that they could turn the force of gravity against itself. In the next part of this investigation, we are going to look at the specific components of this machine that might still be hiding in plain sight. We are going to talk about the blocks themselves and how their very shape might have been part of the lifting process. Because as it turns out, the way you cut a stone can tell you a lot about how you plan to move it. And as we will see, the Egyptians were thinking several steps ahead of anyone who came after them. The ramp was just the beginning. The real magic happened when they added the weight. Now that we have established the presence of a sophisticated water management system at the base of these structures, we have to look at the internal guts of the pyramid itself through a completely different lens. If you have ever been inside a large industrial grain elevator or a modern hydroelectric plant, you know that the corridors and shafts are not designed for comfort or aesthetic beauty. They are designed for function. They are narrow, they are steep, and they are often made of the most durable materials available to handle the immense stresses of moving parts and high pressure. When I look at the internal layout of the Great Pyramid, specifically the Grand Gallery and the various shafts leading to the so-called burial chambers, I do not see a funeral procession path. I see a massive, high-pressure mechanical assembly. Let us talk about the Grand Gallery for a moment in excruciating detail. For those who have not seen it, this is a long, narrow, and incredibly steep upward-sloping corridor. The walls are corbelled, meaning the stones are layered inward as they go up, and the floor has a very specific set of grooves and slots along its length. Mainstream archaeology tells us this was just a fancy hallway for the pharaoh's body to be carried through. But if you have ever tried to carry something heavy up a steep, slippery limestone slope, you would know that is the last way you would want to design a hallway for a solemn ceremony. To me, the Grand Gallery looks like a massive guide rail. It looks like a track for a heavy counterweight. Growing up on a farm, we used counterweight for everything. If you wanted to lift a heavy bale of hay into a loft, you did not just pull on a rope with your bare hands. You used a system of pulleys and a counterweight, maybe a tractor or another heavy load, to offset the weight you were trying to lift. It is basic physics. It is the multiplication of force. I believe the Grand Gallery was a housing for a massive sliding weight, perhaps a giant granite block or a series of blocks, that was moved up and down the track to provide the pulling power needed to hoist even larger stones used in the upper reaches of the pyramid. When you start to view the gallery as a mechanical track, those mysterious slots in the side walls suddenly make perfect sense. They are not decorative, and they are not for holding torches to light the way for priests. They are anchor points for wooden or bronze beams that would have held the pulley wheels in place. If you have ever looked at an old-fashioned well-oiled crane from the early industrial era, you see the same logic. You need a fixed, sturdy point to wrap your ropes around so that you can change the direction of the force. By anchoring a series of pulleys into those slots, the Egyptian engineers could have created a block and tackle system that would allow a team of men, or even the weight of falling water, to lift granite beams weighing dozens of tons with relatively little effort. Now, I know some people will say that the Egyptians did not have pulleys because we have not found many of them in the archaeological record. But I think that is a very narrow way of looking at history. A pulley does not have to be a complex metal wheel with ball bearings. A pulley can be a rounded piece of hardwood or a polished stone cylinder that a rope can slide over. In the high-friction environment of a construction site, these things would wear out and be replaced constantly. They would be seen as disposable tools, not precious artifacts to be buried in a tomb. Just because we do not find a modern steel pulley does not mean they did not understand the concept of a fixed point of leverage. Think about the sheer amount of rope that would be required for this. We are talking about miles of high-quality papyrus or hemp rope. Mainstream archaeology often ignores the logistical nightmare of the consumables needed for these projects. You cannot just use the same rope forever. It frays, it snaps, and it stretches. If you are using a counterweight system in the Grand Gallery, you need a way to manage that rope so it does not tangle or burn from the friction. This is where the water comes back into the picture. Water is not just a lifting force in this theory. It is a lubricant. If you keep the ropes and the pulley points wet, you reduce the heat and the wear and tear significantly. It is the same reason we use oil in a car engine or grease on a tractor hitch. This brings me to the king's chamber and those incredibly strange relieving chambers above it. For decades, we have been told these were built to keep the weight of the pyramid from crushing the burial chamber. But if that was the only goal, there are much simpler ways to do it. The construction of these chambers is overkill in the extreme. They use massive granite beams, some weighing 50 tons, and they stack them in a way that creates these narrow, horizontal voids. If you look at this as an engineer, it looks less like a structural support and more like a shock absorber or pressure dampening system. If you are moving massive weights up and down inside a stone structure using water and pulleys, you are going to create immense vibrations and pressure spikes. If a rope snaps or a counterweight drops too fast, the kinetic energy could literally shake the pyramid apart. I believe these relieving chambers were designed to dissipate that energy. They are the mechanical buffers of the machine. They allowed the internal environment of the pyramid to handle the dynamic loads of construction without cracking the limestone shell. I also want to address the shaft that lead out from the king's and queen's chambers. These are often called air shafts or star shafts, meant to point the pharaoh's soul toward the North Star or Orion. While I am fine with the idea that they had astronomical alignments, I think their primary function was much more practical. If you have a large chamber that you are filling with water or using as a vacuum seal for a piston, you need a way to vent the air. If you do not have a vent, the air pressure will build up and stop your water from flowing or, worse, blow out your seals. These shafts are the plumbing vents of the pyramid machine. They allowed the system to breathe as the water levels rose and fell. I want to be intellectually honest here and say that I do not have all the answers for how every single stone was placed. But when I see vertical scrape marks on the walls of the shafts, and when I see the precision with which the granite plugs were carved to fit into the corridors, I cannot help but think of a cylinder and a piston. In my time working with metal and wood, I have learned that you do not make a tight tolerance fit unless you are trying to contain pressure or guide a very specific movement. The idea that they would spend months grinding a granite block to within a millimeter of the corridor size just for a funeral is, quite frankly, something I do not buy. You do that kind of work because a machine will not function without it. I think we also need to talk about the human element of this. Mainstream Egyptologists often portray the workers as gangs of laborers fueled by religious zeal or fear of a god-king. And while that might be true to an extent, anyone who has ever managed a large construction project knows that you cannot get precision results with brute force alone. You need skilled technicians. You need guys who understand the tension of a rope, the flow of water, and the way stone reacts to heat and pressure. I think the Egyptian engineers were the elite of their society, and they were solving problems that would challenge a modern mechanical engineer today. When I look at the internal mechanics, I see a beautiful, integrated system. The deep trench and the check dams outside provided the power. The south and north shafts acted as the primary hydraulic cylinders. The grand gallery served as a counterweight track to magnify the lifting force. And the king's chamber acted as a control room or the pressure head for the entire operation. It is a cohesive industrial design. It is not a collection of random rooms and hallways that happen to be built on top of each other. Of course, there are questions. One of the biggest issues I have with this theory is the material of the ropes. Could papyrus rope really hold the weight of a 50-ton granite beam, even with a block and tackle system? The math is tough on that one. You would need incredibly thick cables, and the friction on the pulley points would be astronomical. But then again, we find evidence of massive shipping ropes in ancient Egyptian port sites that were strong enough to moor heavy sea-going vessels. They were masters of fiber technology. Just because I have not seen a rope that's strong in my local hardware store does not mean they could not manufacture one. Another issue is the water source for the upper chambers. Lifting water to the height of the king's chamber would require its own set of pumps or a very high elevation reservoir that we have not fully located yet. However, If they use the Nile floods to fill lower basins and then use a series of smaller hydraulic lifts to step the water up, it is theoretically possible. It is just a matter of scaling the technology they were already using for irrigation. I hope to spend my next few trips to Egypt looking for the specific web patterns that would prove this. I want to see the tops of those slots in the Grand Gallery. I want to see if there's any residue of lubricants like animal fat or vegetable oil in the stone pores. I want to look at the granite plugs in the descending passage to see if they show signs of repetitive mechanical movement rather than just being slammed into place once. We have to stop treating these ancient people like they were only capable of thinking in terms of gods and magic. They lived in a world governed by the same laws of physics that we do. They saw the power of the Nile every year. They saw how water could move earth and stone. It is only natural that they would take that observation and turn it into a tool. The machine that built the pyramids was not made of steel and electricity. It was made of stone, water, rope, and the incredible human intellect that knew how to combine them. In the next part of this journey, we are going to look at the exterior of the pyramid and how these internal mechanics translated to the actual stacking of the casing stones. But for now, I want you to just sit with the idea of the pyramid as a humming, splashing, vibrating machine. Forget the silence of the tomb for a minute and listen to the sound of water rushing through stone pipes and the groan of heavy timber pulleys under the weight of a kingdom. That is the history I find most compelling. It is a history of how we, as a species, learn to move the world. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next segment. Now that we have walked through the incredible evidence for a hydraulic system at the Saqqara complex, we have to address the second half of the engineering equation. A machine, no matter how powerful, is only as good as its calibration. If you are going to build a system designed to lift stones weighing several tons to heights that defy the imagination, your foundation has to be more than just stable. It has to be perfect. This brings us to a topic that has baffled researchers for centuries, and that is a terrifying level of precision found at the Giza Plateau. To understand a machine, we have to understand the blueprint. And to understand the blueprint, we have to look up at the stars. The common narrative we have all heard in school is that the pyramids were aligned to the north, south, east, and west because the pharaohs wanted to be associated with the sun and the stars. Mainstream archaeology often treats this alignment as a purely religious or symbolic gesture. They suggest that priests use simple tools like a plumb bob or a forked stick called a merkit to eyeball the stars and then stretch the cord to mark the ground. While I have no doubt that religious ceremonies were part of the process, I have a very hard time believing that such extreme precision was motivated by symbolism alone. When I look at the Great Pyramid, which is aligned to true north within 3/60ths of a degree, I don't see a religious monument. I see a high-precision industrial base. Think about it from a practical standpoint. If you are building a house today, your contractor is going to use a transit, a laser level, and probably a GPS to make sure the foundation is square. Even with all that modern technology, most homes are nowhere near as square as the Great Pyramid. The base of the pyramid covers 13 acres, yet the difference in height between the highest and lowest corners is less than an inch. If you are off by even a fraction of a degree at the base, by the time you reach the top, your structure is going to be twisted or leaning. For a simple pile of rocks, maybe that doesn't matter. But if that pile of rocks is actually a complex machine housing water shafts, granite valves, and pressurized chambers, then any deviation from the level is a recipe for catastrophic failure. I grew up working on a farm, and one of the first things you learn when you are building a fence or shed is that the earth is never flat. It is lumpy, it is sloped, and it is deceptive. If you want to build something that lasts, you have to fight the terrain. Now imagine trying to level a limestone plateau the size of several football fields using only hand tools. Mainstream archaeology suggests the Egyptians dug a grid of narrow channels, filled them with water, and then marked the water level on the walls of the channels. Then they chipped away the rock until everything was flush with those marks. This is a brilliant and simple engineering solution that uses the physics of water to find a true level. It is exactly the kind of thinking smarter and not harder that I believe defined the Egyptian engineer. But leveling the ground is only half the battle. You also have to know which way you are facing. This is where the astronomer comes in. In the modern world, we think of astronomers as scientists who study distant galaxies, but in the ancient world, the astronomer was a lead surveyor. He was the one who provided the fixed points of the universe so that the engineers could anchor their project to something that didn't move. You see, the Earth is a wobbly ball, and magnetic north is always shifting. If you want to find true north with absolute certainty, you have to look at the stars. There is a theory called the simultaneous transit method that suggests the Egyptians used two stars that rotated around the celestial pole. When these two stars were perfectly vertical to one another, a line dropped between them would point exactly to true north. To do this, you would need a very high wall to block out the wind and a very steady hand. It is a process of observation that requires patience and a deep understanding of celestial mechanics. It is not something you do just to be pretty. You do it because your engineering plan requires a perfect grid. Every time I read an article that says the Egyptians were obsessed with the stars for religious reasons, I feel like we are missing the point. It is like looking at a modern skyscraper and saying the architect put it on a grid because he worshipped the god of 90-degree angles. No, he put it on a grid because that is how you build a stable structure that can support its own weight and house complex systems. We have to give these ancient people the credit of being rational. If they went to the extreme trouble of aligning a 2.3 million stone structure to within a hair true north, they had a mechanical reason for doing so. In the 2024 paper about the Saqqara hydraulic system, the researchers pointed out that the entire complex acts as a giant filter and pressure regulator. If you have water moving through underground tunnels at high speeds, you have to account for the forces of vibration and pressure. If your tunnels are not perfectly aligned, or if your shafts are slightly tilted, the water is going to erode the stone unevenly and eventually blow out the system. Precision at this scale is not a luxury. It is a functional requirement for a hydraulic machine. I also want to talk about the scale of this project. We are told that the pyramids were built over 20 years, which would mean a block had to be set in place every few minutes, 24 hours a day, for 2 decades. When you look at the math, the traditional ramp and pulley system starts to fall apart. But when you look at it from the perspective of a massive, water-powered assembly line, the timeline becomes much more realistic. However, an assembly line only works if every part is interchangeable and every measurement is exact. This is why the astronomer's blueprint was so vital. They weren't just building one pyramid. They were building a synchronized industrial landscape. I remember reading Fingerprint of the Gods back in the late 90s, and one of the things that stuck with me was the idea that these sites were part of a larger plan. Now, you don't have to believe in lost civilizations or aliens to see that the Giza Plateau was planned with a level of foresight that is staggering. The placement of the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the various temples all suggest a master layout that was determined before the first stone was ever cut. This isn't the work of a few generations of kings competing to see who could build the biggest tomb. This is a multi-century engineering project. One of the biggest mistakes I think we make is assuming that ancient people had a different kind of brain than we do. We think that because they didn't have computers, they must have been primitive or driven purely by superstition. But if you took a modern civil engineer and dropped him back in the old kingdom, he would recognize exactly what those astronomers were doing. He would see them setting the benchmarks. He would see them establishing the baseline. He would see them using the most stable reference points available to them, which were the stars, to ensure that their massive hydraulic machine didn't shake itself to pieces. I have spent my life building things, and I can tell you that there is a specific kind of satisfaction that comes from getting something perfectly level and perfectly square. It is a feeling of being in harmony with the laws of physics. I think the Egyptian engineers felt that same way. They weren't just slaves being whipped by a pharaoh. They were craftsmen and scientists who were pushing the limits of what was possible with stone and water. When we look at the vertical scrapes on the walls of the north shaft at Saqqara, or the precisely carved grooves of the granite plugs, we are looking at the fingerprints of people who cared about the details. The astronomer's blueprint was the framework that allowed the machine to function. It provided the level base for the water to flow, the vertical shafts for the flotation pistons to rise, and a cardinal alignment to keep the entire system synchronized with the yearly floods. It was a marriage of the heavens and the earth, but not in a mystical way. It was a practical, industrial marriage. The stars provided the data, and the Nile provided the power. As we continue to look at the evidence, I want you to keep that image in your mind. Don't just see a silent desert with big stone triangles. See a bustling construction site. Hear the sound of water rushing through underground limestone pipes. Imagine the astronomer on his high wall, watching the transit of the stars to make sure the next morning's layout is perfect. Imagine the workers at the north shaft, waiting for the water level to rise so they can float another massive block into place. This was a world of movement, of power, and above all, of precision. In the next part of our journey, we are going to look even closer at the stones themselves. We have talked about how they were moved and how the site was laid out, but we haven't talked about the cutting. Because if you think the alignment is impressive, wait until you see the tool marks left behind in the hardest granite on earth. The precision of the blueprint was matched only by the precision of the tools. And just like the hydraulic system, the answers might be simpler and more mechanical than we have been led to believe. There is still so much to uncover, and the more we look through the lens of engineering, the more the pieces of the puzzle start to click into place. We are finally beginning to see the machine for what it really was. When we step back from the grinding gears and the rushing water of the Saqqara complex, we are left with a landscape that feels less like a cemetery and more like an abandoned industrial park. This is a perspective that I think is often lost when we look at these sites through the heavy lens of thousands of years of religious tradition. We tend to see the finished product, the polished limestone, and the quiet dignity of a tomb. But we forget that for decades, these sites were loud, wet, and incredibly dangerous construction zones. To me, the legacy of the hydraulic lever is not just in the height of the pyramid itself, but in the specific physical scars left behind on the stones. These are the marks of a machine that was worked hard, a machine that failed sometimes, and a machine that was eventually decommissioned and hidden away. I want to spend some time looking at what these stones tell us about the people who operated them, because that is where the real engineering story lives. If you have ever spent time on a farm or in a machine shop, you know that tools leave signatures. A saw leaves a specific pattern of teeth marks. A pulley leaves a wear pattern on a beam. A hydraulic ram leaves scuffing on the interior of cylinder. When we look at the north shaft of the Dosa complex, we see exactly these kinds of signatures. I mentioned those vertical scrapes on the right-hand wall earlier, and I cannot stress enough how much those look like the track marks of a piston or floating platform. In a purely religious structure, why would you have deep, repeated gouges running from the bottom of a shaft all the way to the top? If the shaft was just meant to hold a sarcophagus that was lowered once and then sealed forever, you would expect the walls to be clean or at least consistently finished. But these scrapes suggest repeated motion. They suggest a platform that was moving up and down hundreds or even thousands of times over the course of the project. To an engineer, that is not a mystery. That is a duty cycle. I also want to look at those 4 rectangular holes I mentioned. Mainstream archaeology often calls these support holes for a wooden floor or ceiling. But if you look at their placement, they are perfectly aligned to act as locking pins for a platform. Imagine you have a massive floating raft inside this shaft, and you are using it to lift a 2-ton block of granite. Once you get that block to the height you need, you do not want to rely on water pressure alone to keep it there while you transition the stone onto the next level. Water can leak. Pressure can drop. You need a mechanical failsafe. You slide a heavy timber beam into those holes, and suddenly that platform is locked in place. It is a simple, elegant solution that anyone who has ever used a car jack would recognize. You pump the jack up, but you put the jack stands underneath before you crawl under the car. This is the same logic, just executed on a massive, ancient scale. This brings me back to my earlier point about giving these ancient engineers the same latitude of rationality we give to someone like Leonardo da Vinci. We often treat ancient history as if every single stone cut was a prayer or a symbol of the cosmos. But when I look at a chipped corner on a granite plug or a wear mark on a shaft wall, I do not see religion. I see a guy named Hemiunu or some other foreman who was having a really long Tuesday. I see a crew that was trying to beat a deadline before the floodwaters receded. I see a mechanical system that was being pushed to its limits. When we stop trying to force everything into a box of ritual and start looking at it as a job site, the mystery starts to evaporate and is replaced by something much more impressive. It is a realization that these people were solving the exact same problems we solve today using the exact same principles of physics. They just did it without internal combustion engines or electricity. Now, one of the biggest sticking points of people who want to argue against this hydraulic theory is the current state of the sites. They look at the dry desert and the empty shafts and say that there is no way this could have been a water machine. But we have to remember the timeline. We are talking about 4,500 years of environmental change. When these pyramids were being built, the climate of Egypt was significantly wetter. The green Sahara period was ending, but the rainfall was still much higher than it is today. The Nile was more powerful, and the flash floods were a regular occurrence that had to be managed. If you look at the Giza El Mudeh, that massive check dam, you are looking at a piece of infrastructure designed for a world that does not exist anymore. It is like looking at a massive boat dock in the middle of a dried-up lake bed and saying that people must have used it to park their camels. No, they used it for boats because there used to be water there. I also want to address the issue of the granite boxes being used as sarcophagi. This is the core of the mainstream argument. They say that because there were a few bone fragments found, and because the boxes are the right size for a human, they must be tombs. But look at the design of the box in the north shaft again. It has that offset plug. It has waterproof mortar on the ceiling, but not the floor. It is connected to a complex system of pipes and trenches. If I showed a modern plumber a box like that, he would not say it is a coffin. He would say it is a specialized valve or pressure regulator. The fact that someone might have been buried there later, or that bone fragments ended up there after thousands of years of grave robbing and repurposing, does not change the original intent of the design. We see this all the time in history. People find a sturdy, well-built structure, and they find a new use for it. If the pyramid was already there and it had a deep, secure shaft with a heavy granite box at the bottom, It would make a very tempting place to put a body once the water system was no longer functional. I think the real legacy of the lever, and the reason I am so obsessed with this technical detail, is that it changes how we view human progress. If the Egyptians were using hydraulics to build the pyramids, then the history of technology is not a straight line that starts with the steam engine. It is a series of peaks and valleys. It means that ancient people had reached a level of mechanical sophistication that was later lost or forgotten. It means that we are not the first people to think our way out of a problem, using the basic building blocks of mechanical force. That is a much more interesting story to me than the idea that they just used more and more slaves until the job was done. It is a story of intelligence, observation, and the mastery of the natural world. I know that I still have a lot of questions. I need to know more about the flow rates. I need to know how they seal the joints between the limestone blocks to make the trenches watertight. I want to see if there are traces of Nile silt or water mineral deposits deep inside those shafts that can be dated to the Old Kingdom. These are the kinds of things I want to investigate on my next trip to Egypt. I want to get away from the tourist paths and look at the plumbing. I want to see the places where the water would have been churning and moving. Because if this theory is right, the pyramids are not just static monuments. They are the remains of a giant, silent engine that once used the power of the river to reach for the sky. As we wrap up this look at the legacy of these stones, I want you to think about the difference between a monument and a machine. A monument is something you look at. A machine is something you use. For the people who built Saqqara, I believe it was both. It was a grand statement of their king's power and his place in the afterlife, yes, but it was also a massive engineering project that required them to understand the weight of water, the strength of ropes, and the friction of stone on stone. When we look at the scrapes on the walls and the plugs in the shafts, we are seeing the fingerprints of the machine. We are seeing the evidence that they did not just dream big. They thought deep. They looked at the yearly flood of the Nile, and they did not just see a gift from the gods. They saw a source of lift. They saw a way to move the unmovable. And that, to me, is the greatest legacy they could have left behind.